Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we're privileged to get to speak to Orion Aon, founder of Forage Colorado. Orion is a Colorado transplant with a lifelong passion for the outdoors and anything there is to do in them. He loves to hunt, fish, forage, camp, wander and wonder, bushcraft, look at trees, you name it. Orion grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he first started mushroom hunting with his family, looking for king boletes, chanterelles, and hawkwings, like a treasure hunt in the woods that got him hooked. In 2008, he moved to Colorado to attend CSU, where he would study natural resource management and fisheries biology. In 2015, Orion started Forage Colorado as a place where he could share his passion for Colorado foraging with others and with his community. His first big project was writing a series about Colorado morels, which has helped a lot of people who didn't even know there were morels in Colorado to find their first ones. He now offers private foraging classes and does talks, events, and leads forays for his local mycological society. I'm excited to learn more about the unique bioregions in Colorado and the wild foods that call them home. Orion, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm really excited after reading your website, getting to know you a little bit, getting to know your work. We were talking just before the show that Colorado's a very different forage region from where I am in Northern California.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely excited to learn about it. But the first thing I want to get into a little bit is some of your origin story. I mean, first of all, your name is Orion Aon. Mm-hmm. So that says that your parents were really cool and they took you foraging when you were younger. So
we're really cool and still are very cool.
Of course, they still are very cool. But I just want to hear a little bit about, just some of that background, some of the synchronicities that started getting you out into nature and helped kind of put you on the path you're on today.
Like you said, I grew up in Santa Fe. I think it is the highest state capital in the U.S. So you get a lot of mountains, forests, conifer forests in the area. And my dad, I don't remember, but I've always had the story told to me that when I was around 5, him and my mom bundled me up like a marshmallow and took me out ice fishing to one of our nearby lakes. And so that's always sort of what I think of as my start into the outdoors. And so that kind of continued as I grew up. My mom is from Minnesota originally, and we still have family that lives there. And so we go every summer and visit, and we would fish and spend time on lakes or in cabins. And so that outdoor love continued to grow as I aged. And then around the age of 10, one of my dad's friends offered to take us out mushroom hunting. It was something that they had done for a while. We joined them because, just outdoor stuff and all the other reasons why mushrooms are cool. I didn't really understand it when I was 10, but my dad got it. And so they took us out with them. And that year was one of the good years. And I'm sure we'll talk about the seasonal variability of the Southern Rockies a little later, but that was a good year. And so we found chanterelles and king boletes, and it was just, mushrooms all over the forest. So that was just like, got its claws into me then. And that mushroom hunt became like an annual tradition for us. We would go a couple times a year when the monsoons rolled in the Southwest. And some years we would come back with pounds and pounds, and other years we'd just find a couple or nothing. But, it's always that experience of being out there and, the smells and the views and just enjoying the woods, whether you found mushrooms or not. So that cultivated that, that love for the outdoors that I have now.
Do you think that brought you closer to your brothers and your dad, having that experience of being out in the wild and doing that together?
I think so. I think, my family is always pretty close. We're lucky, even my extended family, especially my mom's side, but both sides really, I have close relationships with my cousins and, my aunts and uncles, because we see them regularly and we talk to them regularly. I'm actually playing Dungeons and Dragons with some of my cousins after this podcast tonight. So
nice. All right. We better not keep you too long then.
It would be a really long podcast.
I always just think of foraging as such like a primitive thing that people have done together for so long. So just something about that, the fact that you went out with your family, they showed you this thing of mushroom foraging, it seems innately human and just like, it just seems right. I don't know what that is.
Well, that's how it is in in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, it's part of the culture out there. It's like your grandmother mushroom hunt, and then your parents mushroom hunt. And it's just like a cultural thing that's just passed down through the generations. There's more people out there that mushroom hunt than there are that don't.
Right.
It's completely the opposite in North America.
Well, hopefully in 100 years, as more and more people get tuned into mushroom foraging, that will change, and we will take our children and our families out to mushroom hunt. We'll become a mycophilic society. But I guess for you, I know you then moved to Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Did your nascent passion for mushroom foraging continue as you went into college, or how did that kind of transition?
Yeah, it was definitely there somewhere, but I'm sure as many people, and probably you're familiar with, when you go to like get to that age of college, whether you attend college or not, your interests sort of, trying to figure out who you are as a person.
Right.
Especially in, those like right around 20. So I had a lot of that going on. The outdoors was still part of it. I was camping and fishing a ton. The mushroom hunting, because up until then, it had just been like this annual thing that we would do a few times a year. And, I knew the spot we would go to. I knew what we were looking for. Thinking moving 400 some miles north, it's like, well, I'm in a new place. Like I wasn't into it enough to really understand what was going on.
Right.
And there was a few years in college where the mushroom hunting fell to the back burner. I was still interested in it. I would still check out random mushrooms I would find, in town or whatever. But it wasn't until a camping trip, I think in the middle of my career, maybe when I was a junior in college, we were camping. We were doing some fishing along a river, and I noticed a bolete that was fruiting, like just a pristine bolete. And I was like, oh, I kind of remember that. It turned out that it was actually a Lexina, a scaber stock.
Mm.
But the cap of it was close enough that at that time I was just like, oh, this reminds me of stuff. And then we kept fishing a little later, and I ended up finding some actual king boletes and some puffballs and some hawkswings. And it was just like, I brought them all back to camp, and I actually happened to have a mushroom book with me because it was still there. The interest was there. So I would bring mushroom books out, and that sort of sparked the interest again. And from there, it was just like as much as I could intake, mushroom groups, mycological societies, getting more guidebooks, reading online. And so it's just sort of snowballed into that. And then I had always been interested in plant foraging as well. And trees and stuff was my study in school. Yeah. So that sort of added on to the mushrooms. And so that knowledge of plant foraging and mushroom foraging is just like as much as I could bring in and intake from that point on. It's just been one of the main passions now. So
yeah, well, it does seem to really go hand in hand with your lifestyle, with the interests you pursued in your career, all around kind of a naturalist, outdoors guy. So it definitely makes sense that, that passion for foraging would come alight again at some time. But it's interesting to hear that, for you, it was, at first at least, it was not all about the science of mushrooms, if you will. It was more about there were these delectable things you found out in the woods, but you didn't quite connect that with this idea of kingdom fungi and these organisms are everywhere. It was more centered around the place and the people you were with.
Definitely. Yeah. And very much the food. And, I'm still, many of my outdoor pursuits are all about, wild foods, mushrooms in particular, and plants to some extent but mushrooms especially are my passion in that field, and that I like get more into the mycology and the science. And, I like looking at the non-edible species and learning about them, and trying to study some stuff. It's so novel that there's so much we don't know that's sort of exciting to be holding a species that hasn't been classified yet, or something that could be a novel species for the area.
People can get drawn in from something as universal as food, and that innate sense we have of like the joy that comes with finding something you can eat out in the wild. Yeah. And that can draw you deep into this rabbit hole of studying mycology. I just love that idea. And I think that's one of the great outcomes of foraging is it gets people more into science and looking at these organisms like it did for me. But you talked about your local group there. How much did the local mycology scene influence you? Is there pretty robust local foraging and mycological scene where you are in Colorado?
Yeah, so we have, especially along the Front Range, we have some really great mycological societies. The biggest one is the Colorado Mycological Society, which is based in Denver, at the Denver Botanical Gardens. But that was the first group that I was became a member of and attended a foray. And I'm very active on their Facebook page, where I help people, identify mushrooms, and I learn myself regularly. And then the Pikes Peak Mycological Society is in the Colorado Springs area. And I've more recently, this year and last year, started interacting with them a little bit. And I led a foray for them this year. And then Fort Collins has a mycological society that started last year that I was part of and helped out with a foray and wanted to do some talks with. But this year they sort of took a year off because of the pandemic. There's a lot of pressure on, not being able to do meetings and forays. So hopefully we can pick that back up and get really back into the society and meetings and forays next year.
Such an enriching part of the whole relationship with wild food is you do find this community of people that love wild food too, but then also seem to be of like mind about a lot of other things.
Yeah. And then as far as just general foraging, it seems to be growing like crazy since 2015. When I started, really ingraining myself into the culture in the world. I've seen a ton of interest, all sorts of people reaching out and asking questions and posting things for identification help and all that sort of stuff. It's been really cool to see it grow.
And I've done a little bit of foraging in Colorado in Telluride. When I went to the Telluride Mushroom Festival, found loads and loads of scaber stalks. Not necessarily the porcini I was looking for, but loads and loads of scaber stalks. But what I was struck by is it is such a different and unique climate and mushroom hunting habitat. So I do want to talk a little bit about mushroom hunting in Colorado, what that's like. Maybe we can start with, when is mushroom season in Colorado?
So the Southwest, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming to an extent, especially the southern part of Wyoming, Utah, even Arizona, probably. Those states are pretty impacted by having really good snowpack in the winter and then getting good monsoons in the summer. So if we don't get both of those things, it'll impact the mushroom season pretty heavily. Last year, we had a huge snowpack, especially we had a really late snow that caused like almost 30 avalanches, within a week.
Whoa.
And it just dropped a ton of snow on the mountains. And then we had good rain through July and August. There were just mushrooms everywhere, new mushrooms that people hadn't found before, just lots of rare species that people were finding. This year, we had kind of like an average or just below average snowpack. And then we had drought conditions in most of the state. So the mushroom hunting has been pretty dismal for a lot of areas. And in years like that, you're watching the radar and finding where that rain is. And then, if it gets an inch or so, it might be worth checking. That's very different from other areas where it's a really reliable season. That's one factor that we have to deal with, in this area. And then as far as season goes, we really do have sort of a spring and summer season. The spring is mostly in the lower elevations in terms of edible species, at least the morels, oysters, dryad saddles, inky caps, those sorts of things, starting around April. And then those will fruit through the spring and into the early summer, assuming the conditions are right for them. Yeah. And the cool thing about, especially the morels, but all the mushrooms, with these like low elevation to mountain areas, like the Front Range has where I live, you can follow the mushrooms up in elevation throughout the season. Once they start drying out in this area, you just move up 1,000 feet and they're fresh again. Kind of a cool thing, especially with the morels. It's a unique situation versus the Midwest. You get a 2 weeks or 3 weeks to pick morels in the Midwest and then it's done. But in Colorado, you can pick them from April to last year. We had morels in September. There are people that regularly will find a couple morels and king boletes at the same time.
Wow. Okay. And then I know you had a piece about Colorado morels. I don't associate morels with Colorado. Out here in our side of the Sierras in California, we do get morels, and that's considered kind of a late spring into early midsummer. When you go up in higher elevations, you start finding the morels there. But what is the mystery surrounding morels in Colorado, and how did you demystify it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people just think of morels as like a Midwest and Eastern mushroom. That's like the part of their mushroom culture, if there is one, is morels. They have other stuff, but everyone's interested in the morels. In the West, it's more of the burn morels. That's kind of what people know, but that's more of like the West Coast, Oregon, California, Washington.
That's what I'm familiar with. So you're not even talking burn morels necessarily.
Yeah. And so we get both. And so people just sort of like forget about the Rocky Mountains and when they're thinking about morels, but we do have them and it can be really good sometimes. It's not always just as far as the eye can see, like it can be in Burns and how it can be in the Midwest. We get the riparian yellow morels in the spring, earlier spring in the low elevations. And then those move up into the canyons to about 7,000 feet. I think the lowest elevation is like 3,500 in Colorado in like the very southeast corner, but typically like 5,000-ish in the Front Ranges where I'm looking for yellow morels. And then in mid to late May, the black morels will start fruiting and you get a habitat switch from riparian like cottonwoods into conifers. And so those are the natural black morels. So those fruit mycorrhizal with mixed conifers. And I prefer finding the natural black morels to the burn morels. I think they taste a little better, but the burn morels are pretty similar in terms of flavor.
And I'm sure there are sometimes, if there was a controlled fire in a conifer area, it might be hard to tell where one ends and the other begins.
Definitely. So I think we have 5 or 6 species of black morels, and we have maybe one of yellow morels.
Yeah.
The burn morels too can be really good in Colorado. If we get a good fire year and then a bunch of snow the following winter, next year will probably be, hopefully if we get the snow, it'll be a good burn morel year because we have Forage and really big fires burning right now.
Sure, that is the one upside of fire season is you can
that's the silver lining. I always say that, and in the article I wrote about burn morels, I talk about this dichotomy of, right now outside of Fort Collins, there's the Cameron Peak fire burning, and it's like it's burning up a bunch of my stomping grounds where I've been fishing and hunting and foraging for years, and it's like, what are those areas going to look like when this fire is done? But there's also the silver lining of, well, now I get to experience it in a different way.
So we've talked a little bit about then the riparian habitat, that lower elevation. And then you move up in elevation, you get some of that more conifer habitat. Are there any other distinct habitats in Colorado you can think of? And I know it can be sometimes hard to describe. Like a lot of us, when we think of mushroom hunting, we get to a habitat for a certain mushroom, we just know it. We see certain patches on the ground. We see a certain distribution of trees. We're like, this is it. But what are some habitats in Colorado that really stand out to you as areas that are good for choice edibles, even like chanterelle, porcini, all those kind of things?
Yeah. So, the riparian for the yellow morels, like we talked about, that's also really good for oysters. A lot of the ink caps and stuff will grow in those areas too. Coming out of the riparian, because those are sort of self-explanatory, we have an interesting structure. People don't really think of mountains and mountainous forests, montane forests having structure, but as they go up in elevation, they change, right? So the foothills are more shrubby. And then the middle to low elevation, you get like, in Colorado at least, you get ponderosos and Douglas firs and some of those lower elevation species. And then in the middle elevations, you'll get a good mix of, all the species that you can get: spruces, firs, the lodgepole pines, and of course aspens. And then the high elevations, you'll get spruce and fir mix mostly. Above that, you have alpine. And so there's mushrooms that grow in all of those different sections, and knowing where to look for certain species is pretty important. And I try to stress people learning their trees because of that. Mushrooms and trees have such a close association. A lot of the edible species are mycorrhizal. So needing to know how to identify which trees associate with the mushrooms you're looking for instance, king boletes and Engelmann spruce, knowing how to identify an Engelmann spruce can often lead to success in the mountains. So that's sort of, something I teach when I'm teaching classes. And I think it's something that's maybe a little underutilized in the mushroom foragers, at least that I see.
I second that. And my foraging luck didn't really transform until I really started learning my trees better.
Definitely.
And there's some indication to me when you learn the basics of conifer pines, the flat versus the rounded versus the squared pines. And now that I've said that, if you press me to say which tree is which kind of needle, I don't know that I could. But I was smart enough to buy a guidebook, and I know generally like what features to look at. Do you do any, I mean, we're talking about some of these rising elevations, but when you're going out and forage in this much more varied climate than we probably think of those
Mhm.
upper elevations, do you ever do any like crown spotting or looking on maps, let's say, to see what the distributions of trees are? Do you ever do any, not to give away any state secrets, but do you ever do anything like that to help pick some of your areas?
Yeah, a few different strategies that I use. So if I'm going to an area that I've never been to, I do digital scouting. Also an avid hunter, and so I use a software called Onyx, which is a paid subscription. You can download maps and look at satellite, but you could do this on Google Earth or one of the other free ones. It depends on the species, but let's just use king boletes for an example. Those I'm looking typically 9,000 and up, and I'm looking for areas of denser trees, which would signify spruce and fir, though it's not an exact science. Within those areas, I'm looking for meadows that have openings in those forests, because at least down here, the king boletes like to grow on those edges with spruce. That sort of habitat would be like the ideal place to find a king bolete, in my opinion. Heavy spruce forests with meadow edges gives them the sunlight they need, it gives them the moisture they need, they have their tree associate. It can be difficult to differentiate between spruce and fir and lodgepole forests, which are two of our common forest types in the higher elevations. But typically, once you get out there, you can pick like 4 or 5 spots on the map. And then once you get out there, you're like, oh, that's a lodgepole. Let's go check this next one. So that's sort of how I approach that from a long distance. If I'm in an area, the other thing that I look for before we move on maps is north facing slopes. I always start on north facing because those have more moisture and cooler temps throughout the summer, just because they're not getting as much sun exposure.
Yeah.
So those are the baselines that I start with. And then when I get out to the area, I start sort of fine tuning what I'm looking for. And that's just identifying the trees that are in the area, looking for old growth, if I'm looking for king boletes, it's predominantly spruce that I'll be looking for. Maybe I'm trying to find areas where the water runs off the mountain and will settle in a meadow or run through the forest, areas that hold moisture. That can be really important, especially in drier years like we have in this year in Colorado.
Those are one of the things innately when I first started foraging that I really keyed into is where are the natural rivulets that you see in the side of a hill, the side of a mountain, where water's been running, because that seems like such an obvious thing. That would be where the moisture is. But
Yeah.
this idea of the north facing slope, I really like. So it's probably, as you get later in the season, as the summer wears on, go to more north facing higher elevation. And that's your safest bet to follow the trail of the fungi.
Yeah. So it can depend on what you're looking for in the year. But when I'm driving up the mountain, I don't know if this is probably an anomaly you have there too, but you can see the north facing and south facing slopes just have a line coming right down the eastern side of them where the trees are just like stop.
Oh, I've never noticed that.
Yeah. If you look at a mountain, if you're driving exactly west, you'll be able to see it. Those trees on the north side and usually like shrubland or more sparse trees or rocky on the south side.
Just because less sun exposure keeps more moisture, allows more things to thrive with that moisture. Really interesting. This is exposing an environment that, again, I've been mushroom hunting in once and I didn't know all this. And it really showed in what I found. But I mean, it sounds like there's much more intricate ecosystem dynamics going on. And I love when you're talking about, what the mushroom likes. It shows how much an understanding of these organisms really helps increase your chances when you're foraging.
Definitely. Yeah. And I'm definitely very much like a researcher. I'll get in and research things and Google and read and ask questions and figure out as much as I can about something that I want to learn more about. So that's my personality and how I like to learn. So getting into the nitty gritty like that is something that I enjoy. Not everyone enjoys that. People just want to go out for a walk in the woods, and that's totally fine. If that's what makes you happy and you're still having success and you're, happy with that experience, then do that by all means.
I think I'm going more toward that research side as I talk to people, because usually my method of learning was like run out in the woods, pick a direction and go.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the results aren't quite the same as when you pay attention to what trees are there. You pay attention to what the moisture level is, what the weather, what the elevation. There's definitely a lot to be said for doing this kind of research. That's why I was interested, because you are someone who forages so much and you have such a familiarity with the area you're foraging, what some of those higher level tools are. And it's really great to hear about this, flesh out some of my own understanding. Now, would you consider yourself a professional forager? Are you still very much a passionate amateur? And tell us a little bit more then about Forage Colorado too, and what that really is.
Yeah. I don't know that I'll ever consider myself like a professional or an expert, just because there's so much to learn. Like I learn new things constantly. Right. So I don't consider myself an expert, but I'm regularly called an expert by people that I lead classes to or doing events for. So I guess if, the crowd says that you might be classified as that.
You might be.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself an expert, just because there's always so much more to learn. It's something that you can do your entire life and you'll never master it.
And you said you have a day job where you're doing research, and I want to get into that, what you work with trees. So that this isn't like you're living. You're not going out hunting mushrooms, giving the restaurants. This isn't something you make your living on.
Yeah. So this is more like a passion project or, a passion business, a hobby business for me right now. I offer classes when I can, which is especially this year, super limited.
Sure. Sure.
I don't know. I think if I had just free time, I probably could have done 70 classes this year or something. I just didn't have the time to do it, unfortunately. COVID cut into a ton of that in the spring, and then catching up with work and being extra busy with work because of COVID cut into more of that time. So that's just how it went this year. But, I really enjoy teaching people and helping people learn this stuff and seeing people get excited about it. So I'm trying to increase my ability to teach people, whether it's 1 hour afternoon classes after I get off work, or coming to their house and just being like, here's what you have that's edible in your garden. That's a weed normally you would just toss out. There's other ways that I'm trying to work into getting more of this class while still maintaining my day job. But it is still right now just a passion project, hobby business. I could see it growing into more than that at some point. I have all sorts of ideas, but I'm also not the type of person who would just drop everything and jump into something like that. I like having stability, and
sometimes you got to let it grow in its own natural way without putting too much pressure on it. I find that with myself, that things that I keep is really something I'm really passionate about, but I'm not trying to force the weight and responsibility of my living onto, my security onto. It lets it be a little more fun.
I think that's important, letting something, if you have a busy month or a busy summer or whatever, and you're just like, I can't put the effort that I want to put into this, and being like, okay, well, I'll just let it go for a little while and come back to it when I'm ready. I think that's important for those passions. So,
nature's going to be there. The mushrooms are going to be there. As much as we get FOMO from seeing everyone post on Instagram, it's going to be okay. Why do you think you resonate so much with foraging? And why do you think you have this desire to share it with people and teach people? Because that really comes out, I think, in the fact that you started Forage Colorado, you write articles, you lead walks. Why do you think that's important for people to know? And why do you enjoy sharing that with people?
It's a great question. It's something that I'm obviously very passionate about. So being able to share that passion and see other people getting excited is really the main driving force. I like helping people learn. I'm constantly on, when I have time, jumping on the Facebook pages and helping people identify stuff and learning things. So, that's just something that I've always sort of had an interest in doing. And I don't know if that's just something that I was born with or that I learned for some reason, but, I enjoy helping people learn and teaching people. I think that's always been one of my ideas for what I might do as a career is teach people. Maybe not a full-time traditional teacher, but an outdoor type teacher has always been something that I thought I might do. So that might lead into that interest in teaching people and helping people learn this stuff. Yeah, aside from that, I don't really know what drives me aside from the passion.
Well, and if it's something that helped you this much and it's given you so much in your life, it's always great to be able to give that to other people. And I think when you teach and you show other people, you end up learning so much in the process when you have to convey it to someone else.
Definitely.
You also hinted at there's an increasing demand for this. I'm seeing more
Mhm.
and more people want to develop their relationship with nature. They want to understand better what's outside and what's all around them wherever they live. So, I mean, you're also providing a service for people that really want more of this knowledge in their life.
Yeah, I think, we saw a few years ago the foodie trend, in terms of hunting. There was a big
Mm,
push for people that you wouldn't typically think of as hunters pushing for that connection with their food. This sort of, I eat meat, I know where it came from, I know how it was handled, I know exactly, the entire process from living to a meal.
sure.
And I have that as well. I started hunting later in my life. In 2014 I started hunting, and that is a very similar sort of drive with the food and the research and the challenging and all those sort of skill sets it takes to figure that out. It's very similar to foraging and mushroom hunting, but at a different spectrum, I guess. And I think there's more drive for that as people are interested in self-sustainability and providing for themselves and learning where their food comes from. But also, especially this year, fear of things getting too expensive or things not being available or the supply chain being broken.
Yeah,
We have all these different things pushing on the supply chain, whether it's climate change or this pandemic pushed on it pretty hard, and the climate change, both that's being caused by the food supply chain, the cattle and all of that, the gases and the emissions, and also that the climate change is then causing onto those things, changing environments, changing temperatures, changing weather patterns, and affecting those seasons and the growing ability of crops. So an interesting cycle there that I don't think people really put together, but the cycle creates itself and worsens itself at the same time.
I mean, you just put it together for everyone, though. That's happening. And I
Yeah,
think even if people haven't intellectualized it to that level where they really understand it, I think a lot of people feel it. We
yeah,
feel that in modern society, where we've arrived after, 100, maybe 70 to 100 years of really having convenient systems that are largely not in our day to day life, but that provide everything for our day to day life,
hmm,
kind of floating in this back to tank of like everything being provided for us and we don't really need to have a connection with it. And we kind of cluster in increasingly urbanized areas where we just get to hang out and enjoy man-made things, if you will. And now there's this innate sense people have that, oh wait, this is built on a really fragile structure that if some part of it gives out, suddenly, personally, if I don't have skills or knowledge about how to take care of myself, I'm the one left in the lurch. So I need to start learning about self sufficiency and sustainability. And I think foraging is a huge part of that. Do you kind of see it that way? Do you see foraging? And I mean, you're a man of a lot of wild skills. Do you kind of have this sense that it's a good thing for humans to know, even modern humans, as a guard against whatever you want to call it, but potential societal collapse or just big changes that happen?
I don't know that I'm to the extremity that it's like everyone should know this because the apocalypse is coming, that sort of thing. I'm not a prepper, but I think it's the connection that it creates to the environment and nature is what's really
Yeah.
important. You see people just like not caring about nature, tossing trash out of their window on the road and all this other horrible stuff. But I feel like when you learn that it can provide all this food, like right outside your back door, it changes the way that you think about nature and the environment and how it should be treated and what it can provide if treated correctly and interacted with in the correct way. I don't know that foraging will ever be the mainstream way that people get food. I don't know
Right.
I don't know that nature could provide that, sustainably if everyone was foraging. That's a
Right.
question that is something interesting to think about. If a population of our size now was all foraging, what would the impact be?
Yeah, sure.
Um, but having that knowledge and the connection is what I think is really important. This plant is edible versus a weed in my garden. It's like, oh, that's more food instead of something that's a nuisance, even as small as that.
It places more value on the natural world in our minds. I
Mm-hmm.
totally agree. I think the more that people get introduced to something like foraging, the more their minds shift, they start seeing nature in a different way. And you just become inevitably more conscious about your relationship with nature and what you're doing to it. And
Definitely.
in the best case scenario, a world of more and more foragers, hopefully not foraging all the time, like you said, who knows if that's sustainable, but people with more and more knowledge of foraging, at least some exposure to it, end up having a different viewpoint, more consciousness about our relationship to the natural world in general. Not that that's the only vector for that consciousness to develop, but it seems like a really powerful one. And every forager I talked to had that happen over time.
It's not the only way, but it's a really easy way for people to connect. Like, food is sustenance. That's how we continue. One of the many ways we continue living: food and water and shelter. Connecting that to nature, that's like a very easy line to draw. I think, the movement towards that way of thinking is definitely becoming more of the norm with what I've seen the last few years. So many more people gardening, so many more people cooking, wanting to learn this sort of stuff. And I think it's good. Hopefully continues and it's not too late to help towards some of these things that, having that sort of mindset could fix, namely climate change.
Right. And it gives a lot to us as humans, I think, too. I think developing this kind of relationship and working with these different skills, even if it's something as simple as cooking, or if it's, being able to go out and identify some wild plants, wild food right in your backyard, it's something that really is fulfilling and satisfying in a way. I haven't talked to a person yet who doesn't see those as good things, as things that are like, no one's ever like, oh, that's a bad thing. I don't want to be able to go out in my yard and find food, or I don't want to cook, So there's something about this that really helps us be more conscious about nature, but then also gives a lot to us as people too. I think kind of balances us out.
Yeah. And for me, at least, it kind of brings back like this ancestral connection. Like, I sort of feel like, oh yeah, this is what my ancestors were doing, way back when, before civilization, before agriculture, hunting and gathering. There's sort of a cool connection there that you can feel a little when you're out doing it.
Love that idea too. I love thinking about that. This is what my ancestors were doing. I guess to put a little bookend on Forage Colorado, what has been the response to starting this, another focal point for foraging community? And then if you have any funny stories or feel good stories, if you will, about when you were validated and you knew that that kind of community building was really something you wanted to keep doing.
Yeah. The response has been great. People love, whether they're interested in learning foraging or not, people love to see what I'm up to, whether it's this year I've been really into fermentation. I've been doing all these cool projects and people just like seeing what I'm up to. I've been sharing a lot on my social media pages, Instagram and stuff. And so I get a lot of good feedback, especially when I'm sharing like the food I'm creating from the stuff I'm foraging. And I think that's maybe worth mentioning. There's foraging where you're just out picking berries and eating them on the trail. And then there's foraging where you're bringing large amounts of ingredients home and cooking a meal out of those.
Yeah.
And I think, getting to that second one is something that a lot of foragers struggle with. With mushrooms, it's a little easier because you sort of have to cook them. So you get that connection. Like, you have to make food with them versus wild berries and stuff. Wild plants, you can sort of just like snack on and munch on here and there and just never have any more interaction with them. But when you bring those ingredients home and you're creating dandelion bud capers or purslane relish or jams or fully wild salads, all that sort of thing, that full connection from foraging to food is what people really like to see. And I think I've seen a lot of people get inspired from those sorts of posts. And then a lot of my other posts are just highlighting a plant or a mushroom that I see, and just being like, here's how you identify it. Here's where it's commonly found. And people get value of just those quick little blurbs that help them learn something. That's a way that I learn, is by grabbing onto something new and then seeing it in nature. And not everyone's mind works that way, but that's how mine works. So if I see a picture and a little description of a new plant, I'll hold that somewhere in my mind. And then, maybe 3 weeks later, I'll be like, hey, I think I recognize that. I'll take some pictures of it and then I'll connect those, and then it sort of grows into that. So I like to start that process with other people by posting, a little blurb and a good picture of whatever I'm trying to teach that day. That's sort of what especially my Instagram page is all about.
Yeah.
And I get a ton of great feedback and, a lot of comments and messages about it. But it's just all people interesting and asking questions, which is great. Exciting.
And it is such a common question when you post a picture of a bunch of wild mushrooms you forage or even wild plants you forage is what do you do with them? So that is great to complete the cycle for people and show, here's the second half of foraging, getting home, cleaning it, processing it, and making it whatever we want to make it into.
Yeah. And it took me a little while, especially with plants, to get that connection going. Collecting enough to create a meal or getting enough to do a fermentation project. We've got 7 or 8 pounds of cherries in our freezer right now that we're going to make into wine.
Very nice.
Yeah. So, getting that connection from foraging a trail snack to making full meals, it takes a little bit of effort and passion and putting that willpower and that passion into the projects to make the connection. And I know people that say that it's not worth it to them. They enjoy the process and just picking stuff when they're out, and that's totally cool. But, I think that it's really fulfilling to go one step further and do the bigger projects than not just field snacking.
And you know what? Especially with fermentation, which a lot of people end up getting into if you're into foraging, a lot of times it's just time. It's just setting it up with the right ingredients and then waiting.
Yeah, fermentation is easy. Super easy. So I've been really enjoying that. The other thing is all of these plants and mushrooms are so seasonal. So fermentation is another way to preserve those to have throughout the year. And it's more exciting than freezing them or dehydrating them. So.
And I think what you're describing is kind of social media edutainment at its best. Yeah. It's like entertaining little posts that also plant seeds for people maybe about what wild plants or mushrooms to look for and encourage people to take it a step further, because there are going to be people that then get so much out of that and then go their own direction with it and get inspired down a whole other tangent.
Totally. And then in terms of stories and fun things, the passion and excitement is always something that sticks with me when I'm out with a class. It's just like, people are into it. They're taking pictures and asking questions, and writing stuff down and getting excited. And that's really what sticks with me. One of the very first classes I did was for morels because, that was sort of like we talked about, my main project when I started Forage Colorado was this morel project.
That initial claim to fame. Yeah.
Yeah. And I started taking out groups here and there in the springs to find morels and teach them about morels. And one of the very first group I took out, one of the participants had their son who was autistic, had some autism.
Yeah.
And I guess she said he was having one of his harder days. And this will always stick with me. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something like, somebody asked him what he thought of the day or how he was doing. And he said something like, all you people in the woods with your fairies and trolls or something like that. Just sort of like we're a bunch of weirdos like doing weird fantasy stuff in the woods. And he's like, just don't talk to me. So I wish I could remember exactly what he said because it was hilarious. But it was something along those lines of, leave me alone and go back to your fairies.
You crazy forest people.
Go back to your fairies. But it's mostly just people being excited that.
Yeah, well, we don't always get a chance to be that kind of teacher for people. Some of the things that we love the most in the world, we don't even have a community right around us that's into it all the time. So to get a chance to take that thing that you're really passionate about, outside of work, that's really something that's really a passion project, and be able to share it with others and teach it to people, what a great and unique opportunity. So I'm sure it's every time, someone's running up to you excited about something while you're on a walk, it's kind of like, wow, I'm glad I do this.
Yeah. And, I get daily multiple people who send me messages or emails like, hey, do you know what this mushroom is? Hey, do you know what this plant is? Is it edible? Some people would probably find that a nuisance at some point, but I'm just like, keep it coming. I love it. Like, send me mushrooms, send me plants. Let's talk about them. Let's figure out what they are together. I just love that.
And as your family, as you've kind of grown in your foraging abilities and everything else, do you still go out with the family doing any of those forage trips?
We haven't gone down to our, our old stomping grounds in New Mexico for a few years, but we did maybe 3 years ago. We made the trek over to our old stomping grounds and we found some chanterelles and a few, I think, shrimp rustula zaramperlina, and maybe a king or two.
Nice.
It was fun to just see the old areas where we would just, where I grew up. I was able to walk right to a chanterelle spot that we would always find chanterelles in, and it had been probably 10 years since I'd been there.
Wow.
There were some chanterelles there.
It is interesting, the maps that we make in our head with something like foraging, because you have such a vivid memory of the excitement that came with finding it, that a lot of times people do seem to have that ability. They can go back to forests that they never mapped out per se or put on a GPS, but they're just kind of, I know over here was a path. That's always really cool.
Totally. I'm just like, it's so ingrained in what I do that anytime I'm out, whether it's with friends or family or at work, I'm just like, that's edible. This is this. People bring me mushrooms and we'll talk about them. And I've gotten some of my extended family into foraging. So they send me stuff.
I'm sure you're evangelizing everyone at family gatherings, the virtues of wild food and how awesome it is.
I hope so.
And just a little bit about what you do for a living and maybe how that's played into your love of nature and foraging. I was just intrigued in your work with trees.
Yeah, I think it's good to start in my pre-college. I took like all these placement tests coming out of high school. Like, what should I do in college? What's going to be my career? And they were like, do something in tech. That's what your personality says. That's what these tests say. Computer science, programming, something in tech.
Yeah.
And that was something that I enjoy and still enjoy. I was a big video gamer growing up, and I had that side, built computers and all that stuff. And I was going to come to CSU to be a computer science major. And 2 or 3 weeks before I was going to move, I was thinking to myself how I didn't want to be inside all day.
Right.
So I got on the phone, I called the new student advisor, and I was like, want to do something in nature with the environment. What can I major in? And they were like, natural resource management might be a good fit for you. And so switched to natural resource management. Later added a minor in fisheries. Obviously fishing was a passion that I knew I had. And that sort of graduated with that, bachelor in natural resource management 4 years later. And then if I had stayed in computer science, I probably wouldn't be the forager and outdoorsman that I am today. It's so hard to say that, but I think it would be different for sure. That switch really started ingraining that study of trees, study of plants, study of natural resources when I was in school. And then after I graduated, I started working at the Colorado State Forest Service nursery, which is a state seedling nursery. Historically started growing seedlings after the Dust Bowl for windbreaks and shelter belts. Keep from that wind just blowing the topsoil off like what happened in the Dust Bowl. And the nursery still does shelter belts and windbreaks, but we provide native species for restoration, conservation, reforestation, any of those sorts of projects all around Colorado and surrounding states. And my job specifically is the field production manager. So I run our bare root seedling operation. Normally, when you think of a seedling tree, you think of like a pot or a ball and burlap.
Right.
But mine actually come with no soil, just roots and shoot, and they get planted that way. And the reason that that's a thing is because you can provide way more trees for a lot less. So I grow, just as one species, I'll grow 20,000 native plum to sell every year, something like that. And we sell them for about $1 a tree.
Are they in some other matrix before you give it to someone? Like, are they in a liquid with?
So we bundle them up and then they're wrapped with some damp sawdust. They live in our freezers over winter. So we harvest them out of the fields in the fall.
Yeah.
and then store them in cold storage. And so they stay dormant. And then in the spring, we distribute those and they get planted.
Wow. So you already have such an intimate relationship with trees. The organization, the department you work with, is it pretty widely acknowledged the importance of mycorrhizal fungi? Does that play into your work at all? Do you guys inoculate any of the areas where you're growing seedlings? Anything like that? Does fungi play a part?
In the fields where I plant my trees, it's, natural soil that's been obviously amended as an agricultural operation over the years.
Right.
I regularly see mushrooms growing in my fields, often like little bird's nest fungi or stinkhorns on the field edges, lots of agaricus and parasol mushrooms. So we have some pretty healthy soil in the fields. In our greenhouse operation, which grows the traditional containerized trees, we do use some mycorrhizae additives. And we also regularly see mushrooms fruiting out of the soil. I have some pictures that I took of our little seedlings with mushrooms growing right next to the trees. Several of them, I think, were Leucaria, which is a mycorrhizae species. So we do definitely use it and see mushrooms regularly growing among or near our trees. So.
Oh, that's a great sign. And I figured they're so entwined in such a deep symbiosis. I figure that must feature in your work.
Yeah. And I think there's more to learn about that still. There are people researching it. Still, a field that's pretty novel and unknown. There's so many mycelium and fungal species that we don't know about because they never send up a fruiting body.
Right. Well, and if there's someone perfectly situated to help bring any novel practices into the world of growing more trees, Orion would be the one to make it happen as the mushroom man and the tree expert.
Maybe.
Well, that's very cool. I just thought of a question that I want to make sure I ask you. You brought up wild plant foraging, and that's something I'm getting more and more into. I'm starting with things like blackberries. Wild berries are a really easy place to start.
Yeah.
But then I'm also mixing in some wild greens, nasturtiums, miner's lettuce, some of the classics.
Yeah.
But what is one or a couple wild plants that you really enjoy that almost everyone can find out in the world?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think if you ask that to just like anyone who has some foraging knowledge, the first thing that popped into their head would be dandelions.
Yeah.
I think that would be like, that's everyone's, baby's first plant, right?
Right. And they seem like to be a powerhouse, not only edible, but they have medicinal qualities. You just talked about
capers.
You just talked about making capers with dandelions. So, I mean, what's the story with dandelions? What are some of the ways that we can use them? Why are they so amazing?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say is that, they're ubiquitous. So they're everywhere.
Yeah.
See them all the way up in the mountains, all over, around town and your yards. So that's a really good one to start with. But there is a little bit of nuance with foraging dandelions. You can't just go out and grab a leaf and eat it, because if you do that, you're going to find that it's pretty bitter. It's a lot of people's first experience foraging, and it's also their last, because it's like, oh, it's horrible. It's bitter. I don't want to eat this.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of nuance with it. One, getting the young, tender, quick growing leaves is really important if you're wanting to eat them raw. So leaves growing in shaded areas where they're growing vertically and really tall, those leaves should be less bitter and more tender. Once the plant starts going to flower, leaves will get bitter and start getting a little tough. So if you're wanting to eat the leaves, that's something to keep in mind. The whole plant is edible. So you can dig up the roots, you can dry those and roast them and make quote unquote dandelion coffee, more of a tea or an infusion, but it does have a similar flavor to coffee. The flowers are edible. The stalks are edible. The buds are edible. So it's a really useful plant. And as you mentioned, it has medicinal qualities, but really all of these wild foods, including the meats and the mushrooms and all of these wild foods, have more nutrition than the store-bought stuff. You see reports of like nettles having the highest amounts of protein and irons, and purslane having the most omega-3s. These plants have more nutrients in them. For dandelions, going back to that subject, the leaves are, in my opinion, a little bit better when they're cooked.
Yeah.
So if you're finding something that you're eating is bitter, if you just give it a quick blanch, like, drop it in boiling water for 10 seconds up to a few minutes and just let it boil, it'll pull out that bitterness. And then you're left with pretty good green that you can then saute in a little bit of oil, maybe some onion and bacon. And you've got like a potted green that was something that was commonly eaten 50, 60, 100 years ago, but has sort of fallen out of favor in more recent years. And that's something I do with a lot of my greens, is cooking them. I think it gives you more ability to sort of play with the flavors, and you're not stuck with just eating salads or putting them in like a wrap or something.
A lot of the greens you find at the store, the commonly cultivated ones, it gets boring.
Yeah.
If for nothing else, like, yes, they are probably, they are more nutritious. They're just more interesting, more flavorful. I think even getting a little bit of plant foraging under your belt makes cooking more fun, makes making your own more fun and more diverse. And I really appreciate you breaking down dandelions, because actually I've had people mention that one before, but we've never really gotten the full detail. And I myself don't go out and use the dandelions as much as I should. I think it's a ubiquitous wild food resource a lot of us can tap into. So
in the spring for the greens, and you can find them year round, because they'll send up, some of them won't flower every year, but those tall, lush, really big greens are going to be the best ones to munch on. And, a good recipe, not even blanching them if you don't mind a little bit of the bitters, just chop them up, cook them with, a little bit of sauteed onion, and you can finish them with like a little splash of honey or maple syrup, and that sort of balances that bitter, greeny, earthy flavor with a little bit of sweetness. It's pretty good.
It sounds kind of amazing. Yeah. And we've been talking about mushroom foraging, we've been talking about plant foraging. Obviously, community has been a big part of your learning process, online community, in-person community. Do you have any books for your area, any resources for that mountainous region in Colorado, from the riparian up to the alpine? Are there any specific resources that come to mind just for people listening that might live in that kind of area?
In terms of plants, my favorite books, and they're not Colorado specific, but they're, in my opinion, the best plant foraging books, would be Samuel Thayer's books. So he has 3: Forager's Harvest, Nature's Garden, and Incredible Wild Edibles. He's based in Wisconsin, and he's a friend of mine now, and someone that I would consider a mentor. But those 3 books, if you were just going to get 3 foraging books, or even just one of them, but all 3 are really good, and they all cover different plants. They cover all of North America, specifically for Colorado. The books have a large number of plants that are found in Colorado and surrounding states, but they're great for all of North America. And the way that he presents his information and the pictures he provides and the background he provides make the process of learning, I find it fun and easier than, reading through like a flora book or something.
Yeah, we'll have to add that to the collection. Samuel Thayer trilogy there.
They're great. And he's working on another one right now. He's definitely my go-to for those. We have some local authors that are good for Colorado specific. Brianna Wiles is one that has a good herbal book and a good foraging book. Thomas Elpole has a Southwest foraging book. And then Colorado specifically, Bob Seebeck has some books. His books are a little more expensive because they're self-published, but they are good resources if you're interested in that. And then another one of my friends, Erica, who runs Wild Food Girl, is a great resource especially for plant foraging.
And then any specific mushroom resources, or did some of those books include mushrooms?
I think Thomas Elpo's book might have some mushrooms, but the 2 mushroom books that I recommend for Colorado are Mushrooms of the Rocky Mountain Region by Vera Evanson and Rocky Mountain Mushrooms by Habitat by Kathy Cripps and Evanson. Those are our best mushroom books. And then obviously, Mushrooms Demystified and All That the Rain Promises by David Aurora are great, just general mushroom books. So.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with David Aurora's books. Even if they are kind of centered in California, they're just a joy to read. I love his prose and his narration too.
Definitely, yeah. My library of foraging and foraging-related books is quite large, so.
We won't run through all the lists then, but I appreciate you giving us some highlights, because I know there are a lot of folks who listen in Colorado. So it's great to have some resources people can use. And then, you've been sharing a lot of fascinating information. Where is the best place that people can find you and follow your work and be in touch with you?
Yeah, so I have a website, foragecolorado.com, that has intermittent updates, when I have time to write and the mood strikes me when I feel like writing a full article. I'll post those up. You can subscribe to my newsletter, which I mostly never send anything out. Occasionally I'll send out like a seasonal update or if there's an event going on. But where I'm really active is Instagram and Facebook, and Instagram lately, especially. I've been trying to do post a day as like a little bit of a personal challenge to just get stuff out there and help people learn. So all of those things are the same name, Forage Colorado.
So every platform, just search Forage Colorado. You're probably going to find Orion on there. And then are there any future plans, anything specific you want to share? I know this is a time of pandemic and plans are changing all the time, but anything you want to let people know about?
Nothing specific. I'm going to try. I've got some ideas in my head of how to make myself more available for educational opportunities for people while still, maintaining my personal schedule, looking like little afternoon classes or coming to your house and just doing like an hour of what's edible in your yard.
That's cool. I really like that idea.
Yeah, those sorts of ideas. I'm making this accessible for my schedule and for other people's schedule while, still keeping it educational.
Yeah, it can be tough for people to devote a whole day to a foraging class. Inevitably, that has to be on the weekend. At least here in the Bay Area, that means you are out there with every other foraging group that wants to go out and do some kind of long forage because everyone does it on the weekend. So it's cool to have kind of pocket classes and super specific with someone's yard. I really like where you're going with those ideas. Terrific. I look forward to that. I look forward to keeping up with you and following your pages. And now we get to the final kind of mushroom hour questions that I ask all my guests. And this one can be one of the most challenging for people because there's so many mushrooms to love. But what is a mushroom that you love that you're thinking about now? It could be a longtime favorite, a mushroom that just popped into your head, whatever it may be, but a mushroom that you love and why that you want to share with us.
I was prepared for this because, you sent me the outline, so I got to think about it.
Yeah.
And I recently had this conversation with someone as well. So, of course, they're all just like, oh, I love this one for this reason and this one for this reason. But Absolutely. My number one, if I had to pick one, would be the rainbow chanterelle, which is our local chanterelle species, Chanterelles roseocanis. And the reason for that is growing up, starting mushroom hunting with my father and brother in the Santa Fe area, we would have great years for king boletes, and you find those, and after a while it sort of becomes like, it's this regular thing. Like, okay, we're expecting to find king boletes, but the chanterelles were always this like mystery. Like, oh, are we going to find chanterelles this year? And so finding those patches of just like 10 square foot area of just gold, it's a different experience. And every time I find a new patch or even an old patch of chanterelles, I just see those little golden nuggets because that species, the rainbow chanterelle, they don't get as big as some of the other species, and they kind of stay more rounded down. They don't get that like funnel shape that some of the mature chanterelles, the bigger chanterelles get. So they sort of do look like little golden nuggets.
Little nuggets of gold, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like, that still just gets me excited as when we used to find big patches of them when I was a kid. So they taste great too.
You can't really go wrong with chanterelles. There is something about that golden color that just makes you love them, even if they're not your favorite edible. You still can't help but love the fact that you're finding these little treasures out there. That's awesome. The rainbow chanterelle. And then what has your relationship with fungi or mushrooms given to you? And this could be, something emotional or spiritual, or what has this given to you, brought to your life?
Man, there's a lot to that one too.
Yeah, small question.
I think, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked was the community that I get from it. Connections with all these great people who want to learn more and are asking me questions and wanting ID help and finding mushrooms and sending them to me. Whether that's people that I don't know that just know that I help identify, mushrooms that people find, or if it's family members or friends in other states, I get that. But I also get, more personal connections where I'm going to these events and these forays and meeting people who are just as excited as I am. looking at little tiny mushrooms that we find and getting excited about them and asking, like, oh, what's this one? What do you think this is? Maybe it's this, or no, maybe it's that. Look, it's growing from wood. Those little community connections that you get, when you're in person and looking at mushrooms. There's a lot of communities out there, but the mushroom community is one that's pretty unique and hard to match, I think, in terms of how excited and passionate we are about this subject.
Yeah, really special, eclectic group of people. Everyone's interesting, and there's a certain level of consciousness and awareness about everyone that, I think
everyone's
that's
excited to learn and, learn new things and see what we'll find. And there's just this sort of fascinating, like, mystical aspect that mushrooms bring to that.
hard to beat the mycophile community, that's for sure. I absolutely love that answer, because I think mushrooms and fungi are all about connection, and they do help us connect in really powerful ways. And then what is the lasting impact? This is another pretty big question, but what is the lasting impact do you hope to have with your work? What you're offering to the world, what do you hope that contributes? And it doesn't have to be, I hope they build a statue to me or something super personal, but what do you hope that you're contributing with what you're putting out in the world?
Yeah, I think what we talked about early with people learning more about the wild foods around them and becoming connected with nature, that's something that I want to harbor and help people learn and do, help people become more connected with nature. So if I leave however many of people more connected with nature and more appreciative, I'll feel fulfilled with what I'm doing.
Yeah, and it feels like as we go more and more into a world that's so reliant and intertwined with the virtual world, we're going to need more and more people like you who are helping us also get back to nature and reconnect with that world and kind of keep that balance. Because I don't think, technology is not bad, and there's so many good things that come out of it, but it is good to stay grounded and stay in touch with the natural world to help keep that all important balance.
Definitely.
Well, Orion, thank you so much for such an awesome conversation. You shared a ton of knowledge with us, a lot of insightful answers. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and get to know you. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was my pleasure to come on. I'm glad we got to do this.